Hello, welcome back to the Revolutionary Communist Podcast. My name is Joel Bergman, and I am here with Rob Lyon, another activist with the RCP. And yeah, we are here today to have a special podcast where we're going to discuss the threats from Donald Trump. Donald Trump is back. He has assumed office, and even before he was in office, he's made all sorts of threats. He's threatened to enact a 25% tariff against Canadian goods. And he's even made this constant joke about making Canada the 51st state. It's a threat to annex Canada, which was first taken as a joke, but has been increasingly met with a bit of panic from some layers of pretty much most people in society, I think, from now on. I'd like panicking a little bit, somewhat. And yeah, so Rob and I are going to discuss this issue of what this means. Yeah, and we hope you enjoy it. Rob actually wrote an article about this. It's on our website, Marxist.ca. We'll put it in the show notes, so please read that when you have a minute. But yeah, this is an extremely important question. The United States is overwhelmingly the number one trade partner of Canada. And the fact that Donald Trump is making these threats is an existential crisis for Canadian capitalism. And this will have grave consequences for Canadian politics, for the class struggle in Canada, for the Canadian economy. So yeah, Rob and I are going to go through all of the various issues, how we got here, and what this means. But yeah, first off, welcome, Rob. Nice to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for setting this up.
Yeah, so I guess maybe let's just start with the big question of like, what does this mean? Does it mean that Trump's going to annex Canada? I know he said he's not going to use military force, but like, what is going on here?
I think I think at the end of the day, that's not entirely clear yet. I don't think he's joking, and I've heard people say that you should take Trump seriously, but not necessarily literally.
Yeah.
But I think he's not joking when he says that he would like Canada to become the 51st state. And I think for the Canadian politicians, your Trudeau's and everybody else in the world, I think they came to that realization a little bit late, actually, because I think they didn't know what to do. They had no idea how to respond to this.
So how did the Annexation Act thing actually come up? I know you wrote a bit about it. We talked about it before.
Well, apparently, when Trump made his threat to implement a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, and I think that would have raised alarm bells in Ottawa, all the provincial capitals. It would have raised alarm bells in Bay Street, Calgary, in the offices of the oil execs. So apparently, within 2 hours, Trudeau was on the phone with Trump and was trying to make arrangements to go down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump in person and to discuss these proposed tariffs.
Yeah.
And at this meeting, Trudeau was basically pleading with Trump not to implement the tariff because it would quote unquote kill the Canadian economy. And apparently, Trump, in kind of an irritated way, said, "Well, if Canada can't survive without ripping off the United States by $100 billion a year, maybe you should become the 51st state." And
Okay.
everybody kind of nervously laughed, but he repeated it
And he
at the same
tweeted
meeting,
about
I
it
guess.
online numerous times. Yeah.
And he kept tweeting about it, and he kept showing pictures of him with overlooking a mountain range with a Canadian flag, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Maps with Canada with an American flag covering it. And I think it was around mid-December after he'd done this 3 or 4 times that Canadian officials kind of realized he's not joking.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, maybe he is joking, maybe he isn't. I mean, I don't know. It could be a serious threat. You could certainly see this kind of thought in Trump's mind. But I guess for our purpose, yeah, what's going on? Like, what's kind of like behind this threat? Like, what is Trump getting at, and why is he doing it? Is he just deranged? Like, you know what I mean? Is he just mad, as many liberal commentators have suggested?
Yeah, I don't think so. Like, I think there's definitely a method to Trump's so-called madness. I think what we're really seeing is actually the true meaning of America first, like the true meaning of
Yeah.
make America great again. And I think in Trump's first presidency, a lot of the establishment politicians, other establishment political parties around the world, they did kind of see Trump as a joke, or like a maverick, some kind of phenomenon. And when Biden came back to the presidency, I think they all kind of think, oh well, that's done and over with. That'll never
That was a
happen again.
one-time thing, yeah.
Yeah, it was just a one-off. But now he's back in the Oval Office, and he's kind of got this renewed confidence and energy. And there's very deliberate sort of expansionist policies and other things that he's doing. I think people are realizing that maybe this isn't a one-off thing. That maybe Trump does actually represent something. And in a way, I think this is a reaction of a wing of the American ruling class to so-called globalization. This globalization that's been happening since, let's say, the 1970s, the 1980s.
So, what is Trump's view on that then? Like, it does seem like he has a starkly different view of what America should be doing in the world from, for example, Joe Biden. They disagree on the Ukraine war. That's a very clear one. But this combined with Trump's statements about not just Canada, Mexico, Greenland, Panama Canal, all of these places are fairly close to America, considering the other things are really far away. Like he makes disparaging comments about he doesn't want to get involved in the Middle East anymore, for example.
Yeah, because
Um,
I think it's maybe a bit of a longer answer, but I think there is a wing of the American ruling class that sees America's position in the world, sees the relative decline of the power of the United States in the world, and they want to take a different approach. So the Biden wing, or the establishment wing of the ruling
yeah,
class, hasn't necessarily recognized this decline, or if they have, they don't really know what to do about it,
they
and
don't
they
want to
want to
accept it. Yeah.
no, and they want to keep things, they want to maintain the status quo, and they want to keep kind of trucking along as things happen, because it's all they really know. And when things started to change after the world crisis in the 1970s, the US was really one of the motor forces of this so-called globalization. And they had to do it to keep capitalism afloat, to
Yeah.
prevent a total crisis. And so they had to do this. And so that's what the Biden wing knows. That's what the establishment wing knows. And that's what they want to keep doing. But there's another wing that has emerged, and they are violently opposed to this. They see another way, and they see this wealth draining out of the United States in certain ways. They see the power of the U.S. military and things like that declining. They see rivals in China and other countries rising, and they want to take a different approach.
Yeah, so he's then gunning for the Americas, I guess.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do, like when you think back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the United States emerges as really the sole superpower of the world, and it was able to
Yeah.
impose its will all over the place. You think about the
Hmm.
first Gulf War, the U.S. involvement in the former Yugoslavia, bombing of Serbia, Kosovo, all these things. The U.S. could impose its will wherever it wanted, whenever it wanted, however it wanted, and nobody could really oppose them. But now, 20, 30 years later, uh, there are other countries that can oppose them. And the Americans they've invaded various countries, and they're reticent to get ground troops on the ground. And so their
Well,
approach,
they failed miserably in Iraq, Afghanistan.
the second
Yeah.
Gulf War was humiliating in a lot of ways for U.S.
Yeah.
imperialism. The war in Afghanistan was totally humiliating for them. And so for the Trump wing, they're kind of realizing, like, we can't do this anymore. And they're spending so much money on these adventures abroad and not achieving any of their stated goals.
Wasting all their money.
Yeah, like the total bill for the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, I mean, it's eye-watering.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
The amount of money, and they didn't get anything in the end. But then Trump looks around and he sees that in a lot of ways, China is strengthening its perimeter, making its perimeter more secure. Russia is doing the same. And so this Trump wing, they kind of look at it and they're like, well, we should really be doing the same thing. Why are we spending all this money in Ukraine, which is all just going to basically go down the drain, when we could be spending this money securing our own perimeter? And then they'd be in a strong, from their perspective, they'd be in a stronger position to deal with these other rivals in China and Russia and so on.
Right. So, yeah, that's one thing that's clicked in my brain as well. It's like that this is more than just a crazy Trump comment, or it's a bit of both. Sometimes there's a method in madness. So he does seem a bit deranged. He says like, really extreme things that he probably doesn't mean, but you never know. And but then behind all, not just one comment, all of his comments, you look behind it, there is a clear kind of plan. Call it imperial design, which is pull out of these wars on the other side of the world where we're wasting hundreds of billions of dollars, causing huge political problems, causing huge economic problems, and focus closer to home. So yeah, this puts Canada in the crosshairs, and someone like Trump. You notice the difference between him and the liberal types like Biden or whoever would be leading Obama is that Trump has no scruples. He doesn't care. He said that someone was asking him questions about Canada and his 25% tariff threats and the 51st state thing. And he said, they're ripping us off to 100 billion, 200 billion. Like, I don't know where he's getting these numbers. Apparently, it's a trade deficit, but as far as I look, the trade deficit is not that big.
No, it's
And
not.
even if it is, that doesn't mean that Canada's ripping off America necessarily. That's not really how trade works. But yeah, he says these big inflated numbers, and then he says, yeah, like why are we doing this? It's just out of tradition. That's what he said. So
And
he's throwing the whole thing out the window. He's like, we don't care what we've been doing in the past. We're gonna do what we need to do now. And he's looking at it, and he is this kind of businessman, and he has this sort of art of the deal mentality, where he's like, get leverage over your opponent, and he doesn't care who you are, friend or foe, technically. He's gonna use that. So he seems to be pushing clearly in that direction. And yeah,
I think that's why the establishment the world over hates his guts, because he doesn't follow any of the rules of diplomatic or political decorum. He's frankly lobbing grenades at the established international order, and he
yeah,
doesn't care. And yeah, I think he does approach diplomacy and politics like he does business, and it's all
yeah,
about who's making the most money, who's getting the better end of this deal, and that's what America First means. And there's been a special relationship between the Canadian ruling class and the American ruling class since the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold
yeah.
War, and the American establishment, they've been happy enough to keep this relationship. They see Canada as a stable, reliable ally, but Trump doesn't care. He sees a potential problem here, and he wants to do something about it.
Yeah, so clearly, if we follow the logic here, he's using his sort of art of the deal type negotiating technique to exact concessions from the other side. We saw this last time he was in power. He did it. He's laid it out in his book. So even if the ultimate goal isn't to annex Canada, although you never know, he's clearly trying to submit Canada to the interests of American capital.
Yes,
That seems like the logical thing. I think I saw a press conference where he was saying, well, I would prefer if those manufacturing jobs in Ontario were just moved to Detroit. So he's like, he wants that to happen. So I guess in terms of perspective, like, what does that mean? Like, is that likely? How would that happen? Like, what if he implements a 25% tariff and, the Canadian government seems pretty hell bent on responding with tariffs? What will the results of that be for the Canadian economy?
it would it'd be a total disaster, I think. Because when you think the Canadian and American economies are essentially integrated. Of course, some sectors of the economy are more integrated than others, but when you think about the manufacturing sectors in Quebec and Ontario, aerospace in Quebec, the automobile industry in Ontario,
Yeah.
the oil industry in Alberta, these are almost entirely integrated into the American economy. And so if you slap a 25% tariff on the one end of that, that's going to be a massive disruption. It's going to mean prices will go up, inflation will go up, costs of manufacturing, all sorts of things are going to go up. So it's going to, and it'll hit Canada quite a bit harder than it will the United States. Of course, the Canadian economy is quite a bit smaller and
Yeah.
far more dependent on the United States than the United States is on Canada.
Yeah, so on that question, what is the relationship here? I think a lot of people don't realize how lopsided this is.
So 77% of Canada's total exports go to the United States, and 63% of Canada's imports come from the United States. And
Damn.
so that's pretty big. And the United
Yeah.
States, Canada is one of the states is the Americans' largest export markets, but it's only 17% of total U.S. Exports, and 13.5% of American imports are from Canada. So the relationship is fairly one-sided, is fairly lopsided
Yeah.
in favor of the United States.
Okay, so then the effects of tariffs would be quite bad. Imagine it would cause a lot of problems in America if the supply chains between these different industries, and they're all interrelated across the border. Um, yeah, it had to be retooling of factories. There would be a whole bunch of questions. Um,
Yeah, like where like if you disrupt or you sever that integration of the automobile industry, for example, that would cause a real dislocation in that industry. That would probably
mm,
mean unemployment at a certain stage, so on. Same thing with Alberta oil. I think Alberta exports something like 87 or 88% of its oil to the
yeah,
United
vast
States.
majority.
And that is a big one for the States too. I think 65% of all US oil imports come from Canada. Now, at the end of the day, the United States could probably find another source of
Yeah.
oil. It might be politically difficult though, because they'd have to go to Venezuela or Russia
Mm.
or the Middle East. That takes time. You'd have to have
Isn't that
all
just heavy crude as well?
it's mostly heavy crudes.
Yeah, yeah. They
The
still need
U.S.
heavy crude.
they need heavy crude because most of the oil produced in the United States is lighter crudes, so they do have a shortage of heavy crudes. But you can imagine politically this might even be difficult for Trump.
Yeah.
He'd have to go to Venezuela, a stated enemy of U.S. imperialism. He might have to go to Russia, which is at the moment a very clear and present enemy of U.S. imperialism. So
Yeah.
those types of things won't actually be so easy for the Americans to overcome. But you can imagine for the Canadians, where are they going to find a market for that oil, which goes almost exclusively to the United States? They would have a very difficult time, also because they do not have the infrastructure to get that oil to market. It all
Hmm.
goes to market through the United States in the first place. So this would be really, really disastrous for the Alberta oil industry, for example.
Yeah, I've seen a number of reports. I saw one that said that if there were 25% tariffs, there would be 500,000 jobs lost in Ontario.
In Ontario. Yeah.
That's just in Ontario. I mean, there'd probably be, the oil industry is so reliant on exporting to the US that if he touched that, although Trump in his comments, he conveniently left out that. He left out referring to Alberta oil with tariffs. He talked about
Yeah.
manufacturing and lumber from BC and things
Lumber.
like this.
I think at
Um,
one point, like Trump was asked like what he would do to overcome shortages that would result from the tariffs or like some sort of embargo or something. And at one point he kind of blustered and said, "Oh, we don't need anything from them. We don't need oil. We don't need dairy. We don't need cars. We
yeah,
don't need lumber." That's not strictly true. Like even on lumber, the American economy is actually somewhat
right.
dependent on lumber and paper products coming from BC, for example.
Right. So I guess the point that I thought we could get at is, yeah, we're in Canada. What the impact of that is going to be on Canada. Obviously, we said it's already going to be disastrous. It's going to be absolutely disastrous. I saw a Bank of Canada report that came out that said that if Trump goes ahead with the 25% tariff thing, it would lead to 6% reduction in GDP. 6%, that's pretty amazing. That's pretty crazy. That's the biggest reduction in GDP outside of COVID crash in
Yeah.
a long time. I don't know. Maybe in the 80s. Probably not though. Probably you'd have to go back to the 30s.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd have to probably go back to the Depression. It'd almost be like a war or something
Yeah.
happening, right? And if GDP contracts like that, then of course you're going to see massive unemployment,
Yeah.
massive uptick in poverty, homelessness, all the things that are already plaguing the Canadian economy.
Yeah, exactly. I saw another report that said if the Canada does counter tariffs and they did some other supports to try to save jobs, The collapse would only be about 3%, which 3% collapse of GDP is disastrous.
That's still a disaster. Yeah.
And especially considering the economy has been teetering on the edge of an official recession for a while. Of it like a technical recession for a while now. That would push it right into a recession. There would be hundreds of thousands of job losses, an immediate economic crisis. I saw Doug Ford in Ontario talking about, oh, we'd have to basically roll out mass government supports for businesses and people. But look, they just did that in COVID. I think they've friggin' nearly burned through their. How much more deficit financing and money printing can they do to bail out the system once again? They did it in 2008. They did it in 2020. Are they going to do it again? I mean, anyway, that raises all sorts of other questions. They've already doubled the federal debt in the last 10 years. They're going to start getting into some troubled waters there in terms of the finances of the government. There's already lots of talk. Pierre Poilievre talks about this. Bring down the deficit, bring down the debt. And now both Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney are hinting in that direction as well. Stop the unnecessary spending, you know, and this is really what the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has been demanding. All of the big bourgeois organizations have been demanding this. So it's going to be very difficult for them to roll out those types of supports in that context. Or if they do, it won't be that they won't have that much thread to go on, you know. They'll run out.
Yeah, and well, you can see too that it wasn't an accident that Ford started. He mentioned that they would have to roll out supports for businesses first, and those you could well
Mm-hmm.
imagine would be maintained longer than any supports for workers or the poor. The other problem I see with all this is that, for the last whatever 30 years or whatever, recessions have been fairly mild and fairly short, and there's
Yeah.
kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. So if you got to borrow some money, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Also, even during the pandemic, Canada is considered a very stable, economically viable country. So if they're going to borrow a bunch of money, that isn't such a big problem. But you
Yeah.
got to imagine, if there's a massive trade war between the United States and Canada, and the Canadian economy is essentially collapsing, it doesn't look like a very viable economy anymore. It's not entirely clear that it will have access to the money that it used to. And a lot of the crediting agencies come from the United States. So
That's it.
uh, it's not entirely clear that they'd be willing to lend a bunch of money to the country they're pummeling economically in the first place. So
Yeah, so Canada as a country has benefited massively from this so-called special relationship with America. Huge, you know, being Canada's been the little buddy of the two biggest empires two biggest empires that probably ever existed, Britain and then America. And now that strength that had previously been a strength of the Canadian economy, of Canadian capitalism, is all turning into its opposite. Because yeah, it's one thing to be benefiting massively from, you know, Canadian capitalists can sell their products to the biggest consumer market in the world. Canada has benefited from having lots of capital investment flowing in from the US, you know, developing the productive forces, all that. But when that starts pulling in the reverse, you have this massive giant basically hammering down, sucking on you, sucking the life out of you. Yeah, that's the situation that we're potentially faced with. So I guess maybe we've been talking for a little while now that this is what's happening. It's a very serious crisis. Um, we'll deal with the question of annexation, whether or not that will actually happen later. But either way, Trump is trying to exact some concessions from the Canadian government, from Canadian politicians, that will allow Canadian or American capital to more easily exert their influence, their domination, more easily profit, more easily access. Canada's a big country with lots of resources. Trump's already mentioned that. More easily access the resources of Canada for the American big industry. So, yeah, that's what's sitting before us. Now, what is to be done? What is? I guess let's go on to what are the response from Canadian politicians been like so far? You said they're panicking, they're kind of freaking out, but yeah.
yeah, I think initially you could see there was panic. I mean, it actually took the Trudeau government almost a month to respond. And I think a lot of people pointed out that his own regime was in complete turmoil at the time.
Yeah,
But
Freeland resigned because he was not really
Chrystia
doing
Freeland
anything.
resigned and mentioned Trump as a reason why she was resigning. She didn't feel the
Yeah,
government was strong enough to deal with this. So all that was going on, but I think they just did not know how to respond. Like it's been a long time since the Canadian government has had to deal with a belligerent, bellicose United States of America. Really,
yeah,
you'd have to go back to the 19th century, and even for most of that, it wasn't Canada as such, it was the British Empire. So it's just
yeah,
completely different world situation. So I don't think there was ever any contingency plans in Ottawa or elsewhere to what do we do if there's a massive trade war with the United States, or what do we do if the United States wants to annex us? I don't think anybody had ever really seriously considered this. So it was silence on the part of the federal government for quite a while. I
yeah.
think until Trudeau realized that, oh, wait a minute, he's not joking. I have to say something. In the meantime, some of the other premiers, Doug Ford was mainly leading the charge. He was pretty belligerent there for a while. Uh,
Threatening to cut off energy exports.
yeah,
Yeah,
cut off electricity and all this kind of stuff. But you can see when Ford is talking about it, he has a look of sheer panic in his eyes, panic that I haven't seen since the almost general strike a few years ago, uh,
yeah,
by the education workers. Because I think even he realizes that whatever retaliatory measures the Canadian government or whatever provincial government takes, it's likely not going to have the desired effect. It will hurt the United States, but not nearly as much as it's going to hurt Canada in the long
yeah,
run anyway. So they're trying to cobble together now this Team Canada approach to have this kind of united approach. But you can see the fault lines. Some of them are very apparent. Danielle Smith the Premier of Alberta,
that's the big one.
did not sign this agreement, and she's been hammering the federal government about its position on retaliation. And she's
Yeah,
taking a much more conciliatory approach because, of course, she's terrified. If the Alberta oil industry collapses because it
yeah,
can't sell oil to the United States anymore, she's in big trouble. Everybody
yeah.
in the province is in big trouble.
Every Albertan government rises or falls on the on the question of oil.
Well, it's Marx. What did Marx say? That all governments are essentially the executive committee to manage the affairs of the ruling class. Well,
Yeah,
in Alberta, it's not managing the affairs of the ruling class. The provincial government is there now to manage the affairs of the oil industry. In fact, some of the other major industries in Alberta, like agricultural industry, the ranching industry, obviously not as big as oil, but there's billions of
yeah,
dollars here we're talking. They're
yeah,
mad because they're saying, what about us? All you're talking about is oil. You're not talking about anything else. And it's true.
yeah.
All Danielle Smith cares about is oil.
She's also seems to be like she is a right populist herself.
Yes.
Like she before her in the United Conservative Party, you had Jason Kenney. And he was your sort of establishment conservative politician. Had he been a federal cabinet minister
Yeah, he was
before?
federal
Yeah.
government under Harper. Yeah.
Yeah, federal cabinet minister, whatnot. And he had said he had a certain flair for stating things bluntly, a bit
Yes.
colorfully. And he said, "We have to stop this. The lunatics from taking over the asylum." He was referring to people like Danielle Smith, the
Yep.
sort of Trump type populist, culture war type populist. And yeah, she definitely has been like that. And she does seem to like Trump.
Yeah.
She's also seems to be on the COVID skeptic side, supported the
Definitely.
convoy, the so-called trucker, so-called freedom convoy thing, and all that stuff. So she went down with Kevin O'Leary, the guy who said that we should seriously consider the annexation thing.
Yes.
She went down with him on his invitation to meet Trump, along with Jordan Peterson. So yeah, she does seem to be in that basket, if you will. Funny enough, she went to the inauguration, but she wasn't able to attend it because it was moved inside, so she
Yeah.
watched it on video from the Canadian embassy. But yeah, so she's broken rank from the other premiers, and that means like, I mean, what does that mean? I guess maybe we can address like what can of worms does that open up? Like, what if
Yeah.
the federal government, Trudeau said, everyone, if we're going to suffer, everyone has to suffer. That's what he said. And she
Mhm.
said, no, we will not. So they will not use oil as a bargain and chip or as a they're not gonna and they're not gonna so the federal government said all options are on the table. She refused to sign because she says no, oil exports cannot be on the table. Um, but and then she said if you try to put it on the table, it will provoke a national unity crisis. Now it's been a few years. It was probably what is it, 2 3 years ago? There were like big kind of like sentiments of, I mean, you always have sentiments of Western alienation in the West, but you had this sort of Wexit thing going on. You had this, and Smith
Mhm.
actually partially was catapulted to power on the basis of being a supporter of the so-called Alberta sovereignty and whatnot, and saying if you don't let us get our oil to market, et cetera, we'll, I guess the insinuation is Alberta will separate. Um, but yeah, I guess this brings into question the Canadian Confederation. Uh, so yeah, I don't know. With this split between premiers, not just Smith, because while the other premiers signed it, many of them had kind of been supporting her a bit and were not entirely happy. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I've talked a lot here, but I'm just maybe we can just start discussing that issue, the issue of Canadian Confederation, because obviously there's deep fault lines in the Canadian Federation. The major trading partner in the South is threatening all sorts of stuff. And it seems like the so-called Team Canada is like right out of the gate was fractured because all the major provinces, they all have trading partners with the U.S., not with each other. So yeah, what does this mean for the Canadian Federation?
Yeah, I think uh, when you look at it, every single Canadian province trades more with the United States than they do internally in Canada. So every
Yeah,
every province feels this economic pull towards the United States, and each of the provinces tends to have one or two major industries that sort of dominate its provincial economy, and it is integrated in with the American economy. So you can see this when you look at the percentage of exports to the United States
yeah,
as total exports from each province, just a few of them. In Alberta, 89.6% of its exports go to the United States. Manitoba, it's 74.4%. Ontario, it's 85. Quebec, it's 73. New Brunswick is 93.3%.
damn,
So you can sort of understand, like, from the federal government's point of view, and maybe from some of the provinces, it's like, well, we're better off if we stick together. We can have a stronger response. You can kind of see where that comes from. And of course, if you're in this type of situation where somebody is, let's say somebody is bullying you or whatever you want to say,
yeah.
you might want to use one of your strongest weapons in your tools to prevent losing that battle. So it would be very natural that everybody but Alberta would want to put the question of putting an embargo on the sale of Alberta oil to the United States. That's
That would
actually
be the biggest. That would be their biggest weapon.
that's their biggest weapon. That's the one thing that would really hurt the United States. Might give them a bit of a bloody nose and might make Trump think twice about this. But Alberta, of course, this would be a disaster. If no oil is leaving Alberta to the United States, that means no oil is going anywhere. That means the effective shutdown of the biggest industry in Alberta. So Smith,
Yep,
naturally, being the
opposed.
mouthpiece of the oil industry, is
Yeah.
opposed. But interestingly enough, she wasn't the only one initially. Scott Moe in Saskatchewan was echoing
Mm-hmm.
Danielle Smith. He was opposed. He ended up signing on, and he hasn't said anything about it since. So it's not entirely clear what's happening. But you can see if these tariffs come in, and if there's a tit for tat kind of trade war that escalates, and the economic pressure gets high enough, the provinces are not going to be able to deal with the loss of income. They're not going to be able to deal with the unemployment. They're not going to be able to deal with all these things. So you can see the temptation arise to make a carve out deal with the United States, to make their own deal to save their own ass at the expense of everybody else. And that's already started. And so you could well imagine this happening and developing even further into the future because at the end of the day, Canadian Confederation, it's very, very weak. If you look at the entire history of the thing, it was all kind of cobbled together. There wasn't like
Super weak.
there wasn't a great revolution like in the United
Yeah,
States.
there's more. There wasn't. Isn't there more trade barriers between provinces than there are European states? This
Yeah,
is inside one country.
there's more free trade in the
Uh,
European Union than there is between Canadian provinces. And in fact, you had this what did they call it? The War of the Roses, the trade war that developed between British Columbia and Alberta a few years ago.
yeah,
This kind of thing would actually be unthinkable in most countries, or something like the European Union, right? So
Yeah, one of the whole points of the creation of the nation state was to allow internal trade within that market, capital to move freely, capital and labor to move freely,
yeah,
at least from the point of view of the capitalist system. But it seems like that was not even attained fully in Canada. And Trump
no,
yeah, he's divide and rule. Maybe he can take advantage
yeah,
of this. He can exploit this weakness. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Well, it can seem unlikely, probably is in the short term, that the Canadian Confederation is just going to collapse or something. A lot can happen if there's a trade war. That would be quite disastrous economically. We should remind ourselves what protectionism represents in the epoch of capitalist crisis, which we are in. Different jurisdictions are fighting over capital investment. Um, there is a crisis of overproduction. They cannot sell their goods. So different jurisdictions end up looking for ways to export their unemployment elsewhere. So this is and Trump is basically explicitly said this. He's
he
like, we're gonna take your jobs.
you
Um,
mentioned it when the auto industry came up. He literally said that the integration of the auto industry meant that jobs in Detroit had gone to Ontario, and he'd rather those
yeah,
jobs come back to Detroit and those cars get manufactured in Detroit. That's he literally expressed that. Yeah.
yeah. So this is the at root of this crisis here. The protectionism is arising because of the crisis of capitalism. And actually, one point we should actually mention: this is not just the result of Trump. That
Oh,
all jurisdictions have had a massive increase in protectionist tendencies against each other, against certain countries. There's been the whole phenomenon of friend shoring,
hmm,
which you try to make sure your investment goes to certain countries rather than others. Yeah, even Biden kept in place a lot of the Trump tariffs and all those policies.
yeah.
There was even some America First type stuff under Obama, although quite limited, but it was there. So yeah, this is not simply a Trump phenomenon, although Trump does act as the great accelerator in this process, where he is more decidedly ideologically committed to that, and he's pushing really violently in that direction.
Yeah.
Now, it seems like he is delaying implementing of tariffs. He said maybe he's considered he didn't do it uh, on Monday on his
Yeah.
inauguration. He said he was gonna. He had a list of he had a whole bunch of executive orders. A lot of people thought the tariffs were going to be in it, or they weren't in there.
Yeah.
He said now he's considering it to be due February. So the Canadian government's waiting for that. Has a list of counter tariffs. They said dollar for dollar. So
Yeah.
yeah, this will likely provoke a trade war. And protectionism is the attempt to export unemployment. If all sides do protectionism dollar for dollar, basically what that means is a breakdown of trade and a massive increase in inefficiencies and a massive drop in the productivity of labor everywhere. Because instead of buying more efficiently produced goods in another market, you buy less efficiently produced goods in your local market. That's basically what that is. So this will have a big knock-on effect on the economy. It's not going to lead to economic growth. It's not going to lead to Trump's so-called golden age of American capitalism. He said that the other day I watched it. He said the epoch of American decline is over.
Yeah.
New golden age.
Yeah. Did
This
he
is
say
not what this is going to bring.
America's golden age begins today? Isn't that what he said?
Something like that, yeah.
No,
So
I
yeah,
mean,
this is.
I was just,
Sorry, go ahead.
you look back to like the Great Depression, and the stock market crashed, and most of the economies of the world petered over into a deep recession, and almost everybody agrees, bourgeois economists and communists alike, everybody agrees that it was protectionism that made it worse and actually dragged it out longer. And
Yep.
so protectionism is not in any way, shape, or form a solution to this crisis. It will make it worse.
Yeah, Trump seems to have an ahistorical view of things, though. He goes back to like the 1890s
Yeah,
and he says, "Oh, look at that! Everything was so great in the 1890s. Let's just do what they did." I'm like, "Oh, a lot has happened since then. It's a completely different world." Anyway,
yeah.
but yeah, he's committed to this policy, and
He,
I do think protectionist tendencies are inevitable in this climate. where
Oh
every
yes.
jurisdiction's fighting over capital investment, and they want to fight to because they're going to, there's a tendency to want to export that employment elsewhere.
Well,
So there's definitely been a tendency in that direction.
almost every region is doing it in some way.
Yeah.
Europe is doing, the European Union's doing it, the United States is doing it, Canada, you know, uh, China to a certain extent as well, or at least they're fully prepared to respond. You know what I mean? Should they be slapped with tariffs? Because everybody's terrified of Chinese manufacturing these days.
Yeah. So that's the situation. We have a trade war potentially open up in front of us. Very quick in the next week or two.
Yep.
Maybe more. Maybe it takes Trump a little while, but it seems like he's pretty committed to this. So I guess that leads us a little bit back to, yeah, will Trump annex Canada? Um, is he using, he said he'd use economic force. So if he's implementing the tariffs, and trying to use it as a weapon to force Canada to become a state of America, if that is his true aim, how would that work? Let's explore that for a minute. Like, one, do Canadians want to be a state in America?
Yeah, like Trump in most of his whatever his posts on Truth Social or whatever, he says that most Canadians love the idea of becoming the first 51st state, which is not true. I think there was one poll in December where I think on average it was 13% of people would be in favor. And again, even the question was like, would you be in favor of Canada becoming the 51st state? Not would you be happy about Trump using economic force to annex you?
Yeah,
And you know what I mean? So
yeah.
there was another one after that. I think it was an Angus Reid poll or whatever, and it showed that there was 6% support
Yeah.
for
So it's
Canada
quite
joining the
low.
United States. So there isn't some sort of groundswell of support in
Yeah.
Canada to join the United States of America. So on that basis, it seems pretty difficult right now to imagine a scenario where the federal government would somehow submit to annexation. And I mean, this raises just all sorts of
Yeah, that's
complicated
political
questions.
suicide. That's political
Yeah,
suicide.
it is suicide. And then you have to think like, well, there's constitutional rules about these things. Like, 7 of the 10 provinces would have to agree representing
And
like
there's
a
that
majority. Like there's
constitutional mess. Yeah.
all these goofy things that would have to happen. Would it have to be approved in some sort of election or a referendum? So at the moment it seems difficult to see how that could happen. Uh, but if there is a trade war, if this thing develops, if it goes badly enough for Canada, I mean, all sorts of things could happen. So I mean, you can't like rule it out wholesale at the moment, but it's just very difficult to see how that would happen at the moment. But like when we were talking about Alberta and the provinces flying off in their own direction to save their own skins, that's how you could start to see that happening. You could start to
Yeah.
see certain provinces moving in the direction of, hey, if you buy my oil, we will become the 51st state. That's okay with us, because it might look economically advantageous, and probably would be in those
Hmm.
circumstances. So you could kind of well imagine this kind of piecemeal annexation of one or a couple of provinces eventually joining. But at the moment, outside of like something which is completely off the cards at the moment, outside of some sort of invasion or some sort of military force,
Hmm.
I don't see the Canadian federal government submitting to the annexationist plans of Donald Trump.
Yeah, but Lenin said history knows all sorts of transformations. So, if there's
No,
a
precisely.
massive trade war and a huge economic collapse and a massive political crisis resulting, yeah, you could have a fracture in the Canadian Federation. You could have totally different political formations arise.
Yep.
And there are some people who have seem to be seriously suggesting it. I mean, the main one's Kevin O'Leary,
Yes.
but more than that, I've read a number of editorials in big bourgeois papers saying, hey, maybe not annexation, but an economic union of sorts, and that's what Kevin O'Leary's talking about. Would
Yep.
make a lot of sense, and let's just do that, and let's. I've even read some editorials that say, yeah, if we did that, we would. Now the right wing is interested in it because they said economically that would be great, and we could lower trade barriers and et cetera, et cetera. And also, we would do what they're doing with their federal government too. We'd create a Doge department, and we just start firing people. And like I just read actually yesterday that Polyev said there's too many government employees, and he would just lay off tons. I don't know how many. Um, so yeah, he's definitely hinting in that direction. Um, but yeah, what's the communist? I guess maybe we can end on this point. What's the communist perspective on this? Are we like Canadian nationalists? Are we like, no, we do not want to merge or integrate with anyone. We will only be in this northern place over here, and I'll keep our Canadian industries.
No, no, like first of all, it's not our job to defend Canadian Confederation, by any
Well, it's
means.
pretty crappy anyway.
It, it Canada was created by its ruling class. The Confederation serves the ruling class, and it has been largely oppressive for big groups of people, the Quebecois,
Hmm.
Indigenous peoples, and so on. So Canadian Confederation is actually it's rooted and founded in the exploitation of nationalities and the working
Yeah,
class. We have no interest in defending it either. And in a broad sense, like even if you imagine the union of even on a capitalist basis, the union of Canada and the United States, um, I mean, you would have a larger economic unit, you would have the unrestricted flow of commodities, you would have certain efficiencies and economies of scale that would be introduced. This would, at the end of the day, it would only benefit the capitalists. But
that's
this is
it.
where things could even get tripped up on that basis because, for all intents and purposes, the Canadian capitalists own Canada. They have their capital here.
Yeah,
And you could see some of them saying, well, actually, it would be beneficial for us, for me, or our board of directors to join the United States. But you could well imagine others, they would lose their capital.
yeah.
If you think about the big telecoms companies,
Well, they're
Rod-
screwed.
Rogers, Bell, they can't compete with Verizon or whoever. Verizon has more
Yeah,
customers than there are people in Canada. They would
yeah.
lose in that battle of efficiencies, you know? So this is where things could get a little bit messy in that sense. And it would mean unemployment, uh, because why would you maintain this Canadian factory, for example, when there's an American one
Hmm.
that produces 3 times as fast, whatever, something like that, you know? But
It'd probably
so
mean a tax on unions
it would mean a tax
because
on unions.
most Canadian provinces have. I think all Canadian provinces probably have a higher unionization rate than most American states.
And in most cases, probably stronger labor laws, various, safety, environmental
Yeah,
regulations, all this kind of stuff. You could even well imagine, like, there's the big question of healthcare.
yeah.
Canada has maintained its quote unquote socialized healthcare system. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to that?
Do they feed
Uh,
it to United?
yeah, so they feed it to United Health or whatever,
Yeah.
So things
Obviously, Trump and them would want that to happen. So
oh yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it wouldn't necessarily, I mean, uh, you know, it would add another 40 million or so people that would be paying into their insurance schemes. So, I mean, that's however many extra
okay, so
billions of dollars.
obviously, integration on a capitalist basis seems like, while it would probably add efficiencies because it eliminates trade barriers and all sorts of stuff, it would probably be pretty disastrous in many ways. And as far I can see a lot of Canadian workers are opposed to this,
Hmm.
and I've read a lot of reports where they're opposed to it for good reason because they're like, I don't want private healthcare, I don't want them to touch
Yeah,
the healthcare, and I want to keep my union job and all that. So yeah, well, we don't defend Canadian Confederation, which is a reactionary bourgeois state. That's what it is. Um, made for the ruling class to defend their interests. Um, yeah, when you have Canadian workers that want to defend their livelihood, their jobs, their gains that they've won in the past, we stand shoulder to shoulder with those workers to fight for those interests.
yeah,
But yeah, I guess this touches on the question of Canadian nationalism because I've already started to see it. There's sort of this like hypocritical flag waving, people like Doug Ford wearing the
yeah,
hat, Canada's not for sale.
yeah.
Chrystia Freeland, her whole campaign, I don't know if you saw it, says free land with a maple
Oh,
leaf on it.
I didn't see that, but I
That's pretty
just
obnoxious.
just gagged a little bit when you said that.
It's just vague appeals to Canada. Defend it, protect it, without specifying what they're protecting. So I guess this leads to like, yeah, what the communist approach on, and what are you defending? So yeah, we don't believe in defending the interests of the ruling class. We don't believe in defending the ruling class's ability to exploit Canadian workers. But we do defend Canadian good union jobs,
Mhm.
social services, healthcare, these types of conquests. And the only way to do that is not by allying with the capitalists, by supporting the liberals or the conservatives, by supporting their tariff trade war, which will not be good for anybody. But yeah, I'd say uh, there's already been a like yeah, say there's mass job losses in the manufacturing heartland of Ontario. Well, there's already an example of what to do. I mean, there's been 300,000 manufacturing jobs lost in the last 20 years,
Yeah,
and the response of many workers in Ontario was to down tools, occupy the plant.
yeah,
That's what
yeah.
we'd recommend. And it's funny enough, those actions are actually opposed by conservatives and liberals and bourgeois all types. But don't you want to save the job? Why are you trying to ship the job elsewhere? These people, they don't care about their jobs, they care about their profits. So we always have to remember that. And these vague appeals to Canadian nationalism and Canadian unity are just a ploy by the ruling class to try to unite workers behind them. So yeah, we'll defend jobs with working class methods, defend social services with working class methods, but we shouldn't. We should. Anyone listen to the podcast, don't fall for Canadian nationalism. It's a trick. Yeah, it's not going to give you the goods.
Yeah, it's a trick where the ruling class can get the working class to support its interests. And at the end of the day, when you're talking about, yeah, unemployment, job losses, factory closures, or whatever, job losses, the Canadian ruling class won't hesitate to throw the Canadian working class to the wolves
Yep.
at all. So yeah, in terms of like a working class response, I mean, the biggest danger would be for the unions on both sides of the border to end up supporting their own ruling class in their trade war with the other side. And you've already
Yeah.
kind of seen that when you see the
It's
heads
already
of the trade
happening.
unions sitting at the NAFTA negotiations and this kind of stuff, right? But yeah, sit down strikes, occupations, workers' control if need be, right? And this has to be cross border. It has to be international.
Yep.
And you do, they're maybe a little bit rusty, but there are good international traditions with the longshoremen, the auto workers, lumber workers, this kind of thing. There are some good old
Hmm.
traditions there which could be hopefully very quickly revived.
Yeah, I saw, Trudeau created this thing called the Canada-US Relations Council,
Yes.
18-person council. I did a little bit of research. I looked into who's on it. It's basically what we would describe as a big popular front of
Yeah.
sorts,
Yeah.
which includes big magnates from different industries, um, investment. Funny enough, it includes like a few people from the Dragon's Den,
Yeah. Okay.
like Arlene Dickinson,
I saw Rachel Notley was on there too.
Rachel Notley, ex-NDP Premier of Alberta,
Yeah.
and Jean Charest,
Oh yeah.
the former Conservative Party leader, former Quebec Premier, who was turfed because he tried to implement austerity measures in Quebec
Yeah.
during 2000. He was tossed out in 2012 because of the 2012 student strike. So, and also you have Lana Payne from Unifor, the biggest private sector union, the president of the biggest private sector union, and Hassan Youssef.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, I mean, he's the ex-Canadian Labour Congress president. So what you basically have is this unholy alliance of NDP types, liberal politicians, capitalists, and labor bureaucrats, all in this committee, and their whole job is they don't get paid. It's not a job actually. They're volunteering to rally Canadians in support of the federal government. I think this is really bad. This is really bad. And actually, I listened to a press conference they held yesterday where Jean Charest says, you can listen to it. He says, there's a contradiction in what Donald Trump says. He says he has an agenda of economic growth. That agenda would mean cuts to corporate taxes and cutting the state services. But his agenda of corporate tariffs runs counter to that. Now, the only thing that I can mean from that is that Jean Charest thinks you should lower corporate taxes and cut social services.
Exactly.
He disagrees with tariffs. And actually, he does, because that's exactly what he did when he was the Premier of Quebec. But here you have trade union leaders and NDP leaders joining arm in arm with a bastard like Jean Charest in a committee to support the federal government. This is not what Canadian workers need, and this is not the right. This is not the way. If you're worried that Donald Trump might annex and privatize our social services, well, does it really matter if Donald Trump does it or if Jean Charest does it? It's the same shit.
Yeah,
So
the result is the
we
same.
yeah. So we should that's more examples of why we need to have a working class approach to these things. Uh, I could see a mass if there's mass factory closures, mass layoffs of Canadian capitalists laying off their workers. That's what it would be. It would be them prioritizing their profits over entire communities, mass factory occupations, combined with the demand to expropriate these factories and run them under workers' control. That is what a socialist response would be to the tariff trade war threat, because
Yeah.
we could quite quickly be embroiled in a massive economic crisis. And none of these measures from the government, it's like I even saw in the news the other day, they were asking them, so what are you going to do to save jobs? And they said, tariffs. And the reporter said, but how is that going to save jobs? And they had no answer. Because the tariff isn't about jobs. It's about punishing the other side.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the Marxist response is the real response to saving jobs, the only way to save jobs, and that's a socialist response. So yeah, I think we've seen the bourgeoisie how they're responding. We've seen that the reformists and the leaders of the labor movement are tied up in the bourgeois response to Trump, and then we as the left have to really bring in a genuine working class communist, bring back that communist tradition of focusing on the working class methods to fight, because yeah, these things is not going to lead anywhere good.
No, because even there was a CBC article a while ago, and it said that they also said you can't really see how Canada could be annexed at the moment. But they said if there's an economic collapse, if Trump uses enough economic force and the Canadian economy collapses, you would see social unrest, and then people might see joining the United States as the only option, which, fair enough, maybe that's possible. But what is this social unrest going to look like in Canada in those circumstances? Yeah, it's going to
Yeah.
be strikes. It's going to be calls for social supports, increased social services. It's going to be movements of the unemployed. It is also possible that the Canadian working class would seek revolutionary solutions to its problems, and that would be the only way out, and that is what we have to emphasize. We can't get behind this rah 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 Canada popular front thing. That's the road to ruin.
Yeah, so we're not isolationists, but we don't believe in integration on a capitalist basis, which only benefits each way just represents another bourgeois capitalist point of view. Um, it's just about which ruling class is benefiting more. It's a it's a fight between bandits over the loot, basically. But yeah, the Marxist. So what's our perspective then? We're not in favor of isolation. We want a united working class approach of workers across province and
Mhm.
across the border. Doesn't matter, we're American worker or Canadian worker. Need to fight for an independent class approach. That's why we're united with our comrades in the Revolutionary Communists of America. We're fighting for the same perspective in America. But yeah, what's the perspective then for Trump is talking about a fortress America. He wants to have this big imperialist fortress America. We're not now. I said we're not in favor of isolation, but yeah, what would the communist response be to this?
Well, ideally, like our position always has always been for a voluntary socialist union of North America, which would potentially include Canada, the United States, and Mexico. I mean, you look at the economic integration of these three countries, the cultural ties, and so on and so forth. On a socialist basis, this would make a lot of sense. You could harness the creative power of the working class of all three countries, unite that productive power, and of course you could see this as a broader part of a world socialist federation. But that unity between the workers, particularly Canada, the United States, and Mexico, is paramount. And out of that struggle, like if there's a united struggle of the working class of those three countries, they could stop Trump in his tracks. Not only stop Trump in his tracks, but they could create this United Socialist Federation of the Americas, which would be a union of these countries on an entirely progressive basis, which would unlock the productive potential in North America. Unlike Trump, who's gonna lock it all up behind tariffs and trade barriers.
Yeah, exactly. So the communist approach, the approach defended by the Revolutionary Communist Party, is a united working class approach. Marx famously said, "The workers have no country. Workers of the world unite." And we fight for a voluntary socialist federation of the Americas to unleash the productive potential, to unleash a flourishing of culture and creativity, and abolish the capitalist system once and for all. To really use the immense wealth. Americas are wealthy, but the wealth is held by a tiny minority at the top. But we can use that immense wealth and productive potential to solve all the pressing problems facing humanity today. So yeah, really, this situation is. We've been talking for I think over an hour here, so we should probably wrap it up. But
Yeah.
this is it's been a good chat, Rob. It's I hope everyone has enjoyed this. This is a very serious situation, and that is why this has revolutionary potential built in it, as I hope you've got from this discussion. Canada could be on the verge of a massive economic crisis. And yeah, the only way to really fight back against this is going to be revolutionary working class methods. And within this, a revolution could be on the agenda in the coming period. And revolutions come and go, but a victorious revolution requires proper leadership. And that is exactly what we're trying to build with the Revolutionary Communist Party. So if you enjoyed this podcast, if this has helped you to understand what is happening and why and what we need to do, please reach out to us. We'll include a join us link in the show notes. So please check that out, fill it out, send in your request to join the party. And I guess just finally, I wanted to just remind everybody, or if you haven't heard about it already, there's a huge event coming up. Our biggest public event that we organize every year, the Montreal Marxist Winter School, is coming up in about 3 weeks' time. A little bit more than 3 weeks' time. Yeah, in Montreal on the long weekend in February. And we'll have presentations on various topics related to Marxist theory and history. We have international speakers. And we're going to have, last year we had over 600 people in attendance. This year we're probably going to beat that. And with your help, we will. So please sign up for the Montreal Marxist Winter School. It's a fantastic event. And can really help you raise your level of understanding. And get in touch with the party. So I'll leave a link to that. I think it's marxist.ca/school. Leave a link to that in the notes, in the in the text for the show. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Rob, for joining me for this discussion. And I will see you the next time, whenever that is.
Yep. Thanks, Joel.